Overview of the Bush dynasty. The Bush family stands as one of America's most powerful and enduring dynasties, with roots tracing back to 17th century New England and influence stretching across banking, oil, politics, and intelligence. Their rise began with Prescott Bush, a Connecticut senator and Wall Street banker, who laid the foundation for a fortune now estimated at $400 to $500 million. That legacy exploded into national dominance through George H.W. Bush, former CIA director and 41st U.S. president, and his son, George W. Bush, the 43rd president, with Jeb Bush serving as governor of Florida. Beyond elected office, the Bush network runs deep through Zapata Corporation's oil ventures, hidden alliances within the CIA, and philanthropic powerhouses like the Bush Foundation, rivaling even the Rockefellers. But behind the polished public image lie whispered secrets, murky oil deals, covert operations, and buried scandals that mirror the drama of royal dynasties, like the Grimaldis or the Borgias. In this video, we're diving deep into the untold story of the Bush family, the power, the money, the mystery, and revealing the secrets they never wanted the world to see. From new money to old money. The oceanfront estate in Kennebunkport, Maine, known as Walker's Point, stands as a monument to the Bush family's ascent. Its shingled facade, sprawling lawns, and salt-stained docks evoke a curated blend of New England restraint and American ambition. The air carries the tang of seaweed and the hum of discreet staff, their movements as practiced as those of a royal household. This is no mere vacation home. It is a stage where the Bush dynasty has performed its transformation from new money bankers to a family synonymous with political power and cultural influence. The compound purchased in the early 20th century symbolizes a journey that began not with inherited wealth, but with a ledger and a calculated vision. Over 3 generations, the Bushes have woven their fortune into the fabric of American history, navigating the delicate alchemy of turning fresh capital into a legacy that feels timeless. The story begins with Prescott Sheldon Bush, born in 1895 in Columbus, Ohio, to a family of modest means but high aspirations. Tall, charismatic, and Yale-educated, Prescott entered the financial world during the post-World War I era, a time when the Gilded Age's excesses were giving way to a more structured form of wealth building. His career at Brown Brothers Harriman, a prestigious investment bank, placed him at the heart of America's emerging financial elite. The firm, founded in 1818, was a powerhouse in corporate bonds and international finance, and Prescott's role as a partner earned him a substantial fortune. His earnings, while significant, were not the ancient gold of families like the Rockefellers or Morgans. They were crisp, new money dollars, akin to the wealth generated by oil tycoon Edward L. Doheny in California's booming petroleum fields. Prescott understood that money alone could not secure a lasting place among America's elite. In the early 20th century, social capital, networks, reputation, and lineage was as critical as financial capital. He cultivated this intangible asset with precision. At Yale, he joined the secretive Skull and Bones Society, a breeding ground for future leaders, where bonds forged in candlelit rituals translated into lifelong alliances. In Manhattan, he frequented the Union League Club, a bastion of Republican power where industrialists and politicians brokered deals over cigars. These institutions taught him an unspoken rule: wealth is loud, but pedigree is quiet. To mute the brashness of his new fortune, Prescott made a strategic marriage in 1921 to Dorothy Walker, whose family traced its roots to 17th century New England settlers. The Walker lineage, with its ties to St. Louis mercantile wealth and East Coast society, lent Prescott's ambition an air of inherited legitimacy. The purchase of the Kennebunkport estate in the 1920s was another deliberate step. The property, originally owned by Dorothy's father, George Herbert Walker, was not just a summer retreat but a statement. Its rocky coastline and understated elegance aligned the Bushes with the old guard families who summered in Maine, Vanderbilts, DuPonts, and Astors. Newspapers of the era noted Prescott's financial acumen, but among the elite, his social maneuvers were the louder headline. By the 1940s, he had parlayed these connections into a political career, winning a U.S. Senate seat from Connecticut in 1952. His yacht docked alongside those of Rockefellers and Mellons, and his name appeared in the same social registers. Through marriage, real estate, and institutional affiliations, Prescott transformed his wealth into a facsimile of old money, much as European dynasties like the Habsburgs once consolidated power through strategic alliances. Prescott's greatest legacy was not his Senate seat or his bank account, but his eldest son, George Herbert Walker Bush, born in 1924. Raised in Greenwich, Connecticut, and Kennebunkport, George absorbed a dual education, the duty of public service and the privilege of elite networks. His childhood was steeped in stories of responsibility, Prescott's mantra of noblesse oblige, balanced by the entitlement of private schools and summer regattas. During the World War II, George enlisted as a naval aviator, flying 58 combat missions in the Pacific and earning the Distinguished Flying Cross. His heroism was not merely personal. It was a credential that would later burnish the family's patriotic image. After the war, George could have followed his father into banking, but he chose a bolder path, the Texas oil industry. In 1948, he moved to Midland, Texas, a dusty boomtown where wildcatters chased fortunes in the Permian Basin. With seed money from family connections, he co-founded Zapata Petroleum Corporation in 1953, named after the Mexican revolutionary Emiliano Zapata to evoke audacity. Zapata was no ordinary oil company. It pioneered offshore drilling, deploying rigs in the Gulf of Mexico and later in international waters. The venture was risky. Oil exploration always is, but the post-war global demand for petroleum was insatiable. Zapata's profits soared, and by the 1960s, George was a millionaire in his own right. His success mirrored the daring of media magnate William Randolph Hearst, who built an empire on bold acquisitions. Yet oil was more than a business for George. It was a platform. His handshake carried weight in Houston boardrooms, and his Rolodex included global energy executives, positioning him as a player in markets that shaped geopolitics. Corporate success, however, was only a stepping stone. The Bush family understood that true dynastic power lay in politics. In 1966, George won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives from Texas's 7th District. His political ascent was meteoric. UN Ambassador, 1971 to 1973, Chairman of the Republican National Committee, 1973 to 1974, U.S. Envoy to China, 1974 to 1975, and Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, 1976 to 1977. Each role expanded his influence and honed his skills. At the CIA, George navigated the murky waters of Cold War espionage, overseeing operations that range from covert interventions in Latin America to intelligence sharing with allies. His tenure, though brief, cemented the family's reputation as a force within America's national security apparatus. Critics later speculated that his CIA experience shaped his foreign policy, from the Gulf War to covert energy deals. though no definitive evidence supports such claims. George's marriage to Barbara Pierce in 1945 was another pillar of the dynasty. Barbara, whose ancestry traced to the Mayflower, brought a blue blood pedigree that complemented George's ambition. Like Dorothy Walker before her, Barbara played a vital role in social networking. Her presence at charity galas and political fundraisers, always poised, always gracious, forged alliances that money alone could not buy. She was the family's anchor, much as Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis was for the Kennedys, blending charm with strategic purpose. Together, George and Barbara built a public image that balanced accessibility with exclusivity, a hallmark of the Bush brand. Philanthropy became the family's most visible tool for shaping its legacy. In 1989, Barbara founded the Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy, a nonprofit dedicated to improving reading skills across generations. The foundation funded programs in all 50 states, from urban libraries to rural schools, and its impact was undeniable. Millions of Americans gained access to educational resources. Similarly, George H.W. Bush's Points of Light initiative, launched during his presidency, promoted volunteerism as a national ethos. By 2025, Points of Light operates in over 30 countries, coordinating millions of volunteer hours annually. Its cultural impact rivals that of Andrew Mellon's National Gallery of Art, a testament to the power of strategic giving. Critics argue that these initiatives polish the Bush image, deflecting scrutiny from oil wealth or political controversies. Supporters counter that the foundations delivered tangible social good, channeling millions into education, disaster relief, and community development. Behind the scenes, the family's legal teams structured charitable trusts that offered tax benefits while preserving wealth. These trusts, often irrevocable, shielded assets from estate taxes and public disclosure, a tactic perfected by families like the Mellons. The result was a dual victory: moral capital from philanthropy and financial capital from tax-advantaged structures. In 1988, George H.W. Bush won the presidency, becoming the 41st president of the United States. The Kennebunkport estate transformed into the Summer White House, a hub where global leaders dined on lobster and cabinet officials arrived by helicopter. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and Bush's measured response, avoiding triumphalism while supporting German reunification, earned him praise as a steady hand. In 1991, he led a coalition of 34 nations to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait in the Gulf War, a military success that boosted his approval ratings to 89%. The war also intertwined the Bush name with oil geopolitics. Zapata's offshore drilling legacy and George's Texas oil roots fueled speculation about hidden motives, though congressional inquiries found no direct evidence of profiteering. Bush's presidency was not without flaws. His 1990 budget deal, which raised taxes despite a no new taxes pledge, alienated conservatives. The 1992 recession further eroded his support, and he lost his re-election bid to Bill Clinton. Yet his single term solidified the Bush dynasty's place in history. The Gulf War established military gravitas, and his foreign policy credentials, honed at the UN, China, and CIA, set a standard for global leadership. George Walker Bush, born in 1946, inherited his father's ambition, but carved a distinct path. Raised in Midland, Texas, he embraced a folksy persona, far from the patrician air of Kennebunkport. After Yale and Harvard Business School, he returned to the oil industry, founding Arbusto Energy in 1977. The venture struggled, but his stake in the Texas Rangers baseball team proved lucrative, netting him $15 million when the team was sold in 1998. His business ventures, while less transformative than Zapata, gave him a platform to enter politics. Elected governor of Texas in 1994, George W. Bush campaigned as a compassionate conservative, blending populism with reform. His 2000 presidential victory, secured after a contentious Florida recount, marked the second Bush presidency in 12 years. Critics called it dynastic entitlement. Supporters pointed to his electoral mandate. His presidency, however, was defined by the September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks and the subsequent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The Iraq War, launched in 2003, remains divisive. Proponents argued it dismantled a tyrannical regime. Detractors saw it as an oil-driven misadventure. The Carlyle Group, a private equity firm with Bush family ties, became a lightning rod for conspiracy theories, its defense investments scrutinized in media exposés. No definitive evidence linked the Bushes to war profiteering, but the controversy underscored the persistent new money stigma. John Ellis Jeb Bush, born in 1953, extended the family's political reach as governor of Florida from 1999 to 2007. His tenure focused on education reform and hurricane preparedness, earning bipartisan respect. Yet his 2016 presidential campaign faltered as voters rejected the idea of a third Bush president. The backlash reflected dynastic fatigue, a reminder that even old money can lose its luster if perceived as out of touch. The Bush fortune, estimated by Forbes at $400 to $500 million, is a complex lattice of real estate investments and trusts. The Kennebunkport estate, valued at over $10 million, is a cultural and financial anchor. Properties in Houston and Dallas, including George W. Bush's Preston Hollow Mansion, add to the portfolio. Investments in the Carlyle Group, which manages billions in defense and energy assets, provide steady returns. Zapata's holdings, sold in the 1990s, were reinvested into diversified funds, insulating the family from market volatility. Philanthropy remains a core asset. The Bush Foundation supports education and health initiatives, often in partnership with corporations like ExxonMobil. Points of Light's Atlanta headquarters coordinates global volunteer efforts, enhancing the family's soft power. Each charitable dollar yields influence, strengthening ties with elites and policymakers. Prescott Bush's Nazi business ties. In the early 1930s, Wall Street was a landscape of desperation and resilience. The Great Depression had gutted markets, leaving brokers in disheveled suits pacing beneath stock tickers that delivered relentless bad news. Above the chaos, in a corner office at Brown Brothers Harriman, sat Prescott Sheldon Bush, tall, impeccably groomed, his Yale class ring catching the light as he signed documents with a steady hand. To the public, he was the archetype of financial respectability. A partner at one of America's most prestigious investment banks, a Connecticut gentleman who moves seamlessly between boardrooms and yacht clubs. Yet within his office, among the ledgers and carbon copies, lay evidence of a controversial transaction. Prescott Bush was overseeing accounts for Union Banking Corporation, UBC, a small but significant entity managing funds linked to Fritz Thyssen, a German industrialist openly aligned with Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party. The Great Depression, triggered by the 1929 stock market crash, plunged the United States into economic turmoil. Unemployment soared to 25%, banks collapsed, and businesses scrambled to survive. Wall Street, once a symbol of prosperity, became a battleground where financiers fought to preserve wealth amid shrinking opportunities. Brown Brothers Harriman, where Prescott Bush had risen to partner by 1931, was a rare island of stability. Founded in 1818, The firm specialized in international finance, corporate bonds, and wealth management for America's elite. Prescott, born in 1895 to a middle-class Ohio family, had leveraged his Yale education and Skull and Bones connections to secure his place in this exclusive world. The early 1930s were also a time of geopolitical flux. In Europe, the Weimar Republic's collapse gave rise to extremist movements, including Hitler's National Socialist Party, which gained power in 1933. Across the Atlantic, American isolationism dominated public sentiment. Figures like Senator Gerald Nye argued that U.S. involvement in World War I had been driven by profiteering bankers, a narrative that fueled distrust of international finance. Yet for Wall Street, Europe remained a lucrative market. German industrialists, seeking to rebuild after the Versailles Treaty's reparations, attracted American investment. Prescott Bush, like many of his peers, saw these transactions as business as usual, opportunities to generate fees in a depressed economy. Union Banking Corporation, incorporated in New York in 1924, was a niche operation under the umbrella of Brown Brothers Harriman. Its stated purpose was to facilitate investment between American and European entities, particularly those tied to the Harriman family's railroad and shipping interests. In practice, UBC served as a conduit for managing foreign accounts, including those of Fritz Thyssen, a Ruhr Valley magnate whose family controlled United Steelworks, Germany's largest steel producer. By the late 1920s, Thyssen was a prominent supporter of Hitler, providing financial backing to the Nazi Party and publishing his allegiance in his 1931 book, I Paid Hitler. Through UBC, Thyssen held approximately $1.5 million in assets, a sum equivalent to roughly $30 million in 2025 dollars, invested in American securities and managed by Prescott Bush and his colleagues. Prescott's role was administrative but critical. As a director of UBC, he authorized transfers, signed dividend statements, and ensured the accounts complied with U.S. banking regulations. These transactions generated commissions for Brown Brothers Harriman, bolstering the firm's revenue during lean years. Thyssen's funds, derived from steel and coal operations, were not illegal in the early 1930s. The U.S. was at peace with Germany, and international banking often involved clients with controversial affiliations. Comparable dealings were common. Andrew Mellon's Alcoa secured coal contracts in Europe, and J.P. Morgan facilitated loans to Mussolini's Italy. In the pre-war era, moral scrutiny of foreign clients was secondary to profit. The early 1930s were marked by a disconnect between American business and European politics. Hitler's rise was alarming to some. Jewish advocacy groups in New York were already sounding warnings, but many U.S. executives viewed the Nazi Party as a transient faction that would moderate under economic pressure. Isolationist sentiment, codified in the 1935 Neutrality Acts, discouraged U.S. involvement in foreign quarrels. Prescott Bush, a Republican with political ambitions, operated in this environment. His focus was on building wealth and social capital, not dissecting the ideologies of overseas clients. To him, Thyssen was a ledger entry, not a harbinger of genocide. This perspective was not unique. The House of Savoy, Italy's monarchy, maintained ties with Mussolini to preserve its influence, much as American banks courted German industrialists to preserve cash flow. Yet the scale of Thyssen's support for Hitler, funding propaganda, arming paramilitary groups, sets UBC's activities apart. United Steelworks, fueled by Thyssen's capital, produced roughly half of Germany's armored plate by 1938, contributing to the Wehrmacht's buildup. Prescott's commissions, though modest, were a small but real link in this chain. raising questions about complicity that would emerge later. The U.S. entry into World War II in December 1941 changed everything. Public opinion shifted from isolationism to unity against the Axis powers. The Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, expanded in 1941, empowered the government to seize assets linked to enemy nations. In October 1942, the Office of Alien Property Custodian targeted UBC, identifying Thyssen's accounts as enemy national property due to his Nazi affiliations. Federal agents raided UBC's New York office, seizing records and freezing $1.5 million in assets. The confiscation order, documented in Vesting Order 248, is a matter of public record, preserved in the National Archives with Treasury Department seals. The seizure was a crisis for Prescott Bush. At 47, he was preparing to run for the U.S. Senate from Connecticut, a stepping stone to national prominence. The UBC connection, if publicized, could derail his campaign and tarnish Brown Brothers' Harriman. The Nazi label was especially toxic. By 1942, reports of concentration camps were filtering into U.S. newspapers, and war bond drives demanded unimpeachable patriotism. A scandal linking a Republican candidate to Hitler's financier risked not only Prescott's career, but also the party's midterm prospects. Prescott and his allies acted swiftly to contain the damage. Brown Brothers Harriman cooperated with the seizure, providing records to federal investigators and distancing itself from UBC's operations. Prescott resigned from UBC's board, a move that minimized his public association with the bank. Behind the scenes, Republican operatives and Senate allies ensured the story remained low profile. Newspaper coverage was sparse, limited to brief mentions of foreign asset reviews in financial sections. The wartime press, constrained by censorship norms and focused on battlefield updates, showed little appetite for a complex banking story. This containment strategy echoed tactics used by other elites. William Randolph Hearst, whose early editorials had praised Nazi efficiency, deflected criticism by pivoting to patriotic war coverage. Andrew Mellon, accused of tax evasion in the 1930s, redirected scrutiny through well-timed philanthropy. Prescott's response was similarly calculated. He increased his visibility in war bond drives and veterans organizations, reinforcing his image as a patriot. By 1943, the UBC episode had faded from public view, buried in government vaults and overshadowed by the war's urgency. The lack of lasting fallout is striking. No congressional hearings targeted Prescott, and no major outlet pursued the story aggressively. Historians later noted that his elite networks, Yale's Skull and Bones and the Union League Club, provided a buffer. These circles, accustomed to protecting their own, likely influenced editors and politicians to let the matter rest. The result was a near-total erasure of the scandal from Prescott's public narrative, a feat that contrasts with Hearst's prolonged battles with Hollywood caricatures or the House of Savoy's eventual exile. In 1952, Prescott won a U.S. Senate seat from Connecticut, campaigning on fiscal conservatism and national security. His tenure was unremarkable but respectable, focusing on banking reform and veterans' benefits. The UBC scandal never resurfaced in campaign attacks or Senate debates, a testament to the earlier hush-up's success. Reporters asked about his Wall Street career, but questions were soft, centered on economic policy rather than Thyssen. By the time he retired in 1963, Prescott was a respected elder statesman, his legacy tied to public service rather than pre-war banking. The Bush dynasty's ascent continued. Prescott's son, George Herbert Walker Bush, served as CIA director, 1976 to 1977, vice president, 1981 to 1989, and President 1989 to 1993. His grandson George W. Bush governed Texas 1995 to 2000 and became president 2001 to 2009. Through these decades, the UBC story remained a footnote, occasionally revived by investigative journalists or left-leaning outlets, but never gaining mainstream traction. When questioned, George H.W. Bush's aides dismissed it as a closed matter from 1942, while George W. Bush deflected with humor, calling his grandfather a banker in less enlightened times. These responses, polished by campaign strategists, neutralized the issue in fast-moving news cycles. George H.W. Bush's secret CIA Iran-Contra role. In the mid-1980s, Washington, D.C. was a nexus of ambition and secrecy, where the Reagan administration navigated a labyrinth of Cold War challenges. By late summer 1986, a covert operation was unfolding within the old executive office building, where national security aides worked late into the night, their desks strewn with classified documents marked eyes only. This operation, known as the Iran-Contra affair, involved selling U.S. missiles to Iran, a state sponsor of terrorism, in exchange for American hostages, and diverting profits to Nicaraguan Contra rebels, defying congressional bans. At the heart of this controversy is Vice President George H.W. Bush, whose alleged role has fueled decades of debate. Was he a key orchestrator, leveraging his CIA experience, or a peripheral figure, as he claimed, out of the loop? The Iran-Contra affair was rooted in the Cold War's final decade, a period of intense U.S.-Soviet rivalry. Ronald Reagan's 1980 election ushered in a hawkish agenda to counter communism globally. In Central America, the Nicaraguan Sandinista government, aligned with Cuba and the Soviet Union, faced opposition from the U.S.-backed Contras, a rebel group seeking to topple the regime. By 1984, public and congressional skepticism of U.S. involvement led to the Boland Amendment, which prohibited direct military aid to the Contras. This restriction frustrated Reagan's National Security Council, which sought alternative funding to sustain the rebels. Simultaneously, the Middle East presented a parallel crisis. Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution had made it a U.S. adversary, subject to an arms embargo due to its support for Hezbollah, a Lebanese militia holding 7 American hostages. The Reagan administration saw an opportunity to address both issues through a single operation. Selling arms to Iran could secure hostage releases, open channels with moderate Iranian factions, and generate funds to bypass the Boland Amendment. This plan, executed by a small NSC and CIA team, operated in secrecy to avoid congressional oversight and public scrutiny. George H.W. Bush amassing expertise in intelligence and diplomacy. His Texas oil ventures with Zapata Petroleum and his Yale pedigree added private sector and elite networks to his resume. As vice president, Bush was a loyal deputy to Reagan, attending high-level briefings and traveling abroad on diplomatic missions. His public persona, calm, patrician, understated, belied a deep understanding of covert operations, making him a potential asset to Iran-Contra's architects. The 1980s political climate amplified the stakes. Reagan's popularity, bolstered by economic recovery and anti-communist rhetoric, gave the administration leeway to pursue bold policies. However, Congress, led by a Democratic House, was wary of executive overreach, especially after Vietnam and Watergate. The Iran-Contra operation, by bypassing legislative checks, risked a constitutional crisis if exposed. Bush's role, whether active or passive, was critical. As a potential 1988 presidential candidate, his reputation hung in the balance, and any scandal could jeopardize the Republican agenda. The Iran-Contra operation was a sophisticated scheme blending arms deals, financial subterfuge, and diplomatic maneuvering. Between August 1985 and October 1986, the U.S. facilitated the sale of over 2,000 TW anti-tank missiles, 18 Hawk anti-aircraft missiles, and spare parts to Iran, primarily through Israeli intermediaries. These transactions violated the U.S. arms embargo, enacted in 1980, and required third-party export licenses to mask American involvement. Shipments were routed through European cutouts, private airlines, and defense contractors to Iranian airfields, often under cover of night to evade journalists and intelligence leaks. The operation's primary goal was to secure the release of American hostages held by Hezbollah in Lebanon. Iranian officials seeking Western weapons to counter Iraq in the Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988, pressured Hezbollah to comply. 3 hostages were freed between 1985 and 1986, though others were later taken, undermining the strategy's success. A secondary goal, less publicized, was to cultivate ties with Iranian moderates, a long-shot bid to influence Tehran's post-Khomeini future. The financial component was equally audacious. The arms sales generated significant profits due to inflated prices charged to Iran. A handwritten note by Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, the NSC's point man, outlined the math. $3.6 million in procurement costs yielded $15.1 million in revenue, leaving an $11.5 million surplus labeled for humanitarian aid. This surplus was deposited in Swiss bank accounts controlled by North and redirected to the Contras, funding weapons, ammunition, and supplies in defiance of the Boland Amendment. The term humanitarian was a deliberate misnomer, as most funds supported military operations. The operation's logistics relied on a small, trusted team. North, a charismatic Marine officer, coordinated with National Security Advisor John Poindexter, CIA logistics specialist, and Israeli intelligence. European middlemen, including arms dealers and private pilots, handled transshipments from bases like Rhein-Main in Germany to Bandar Abbas in Iran. Secrecy was paramount. Documents were shredded, communications used encrypted channels, and White House schedules omitted sensitive meetings to limit exposure. The central question is the extent of George H.W. Bush's involvement in Iran-Contra. Critics argue he was a key player, leveraging his CIA background and Middle East contacts to approve arms transfers and guide profit diversions. Supporters contend he was a marginal figure, briefed on the operation but not directing it, constrained by his vice presidential role. Primary sources offer compelling but ambiguous evidence, fueling ongoing debate. Oliver North's notebooks, declassified in the 1990s, are a critical source. Multiple entries reference VP input, alongside timelines for missile shipments and European transshipments. A 1986 note suggests using the vice president's contacts for logistics, implying Bush's network, spanning oil executives, Saudi officials, and Israeli intelligence, facilitated covert channels. Another entry lists Bush's initials next to a column detailing Tau missile pricing, suggesting he was cleared for sensitive financial briefings. These references, while not conclusive, indicate Bush was more than a bystander. CIA situation reports, partially declassified, provide further clues. A 1986 report notes that Bush's staff coordinated with defense industry middlemen in Europe and Israel, ensuring cargoes reached Iran undetected. The report uses coded language, referring to senior principals aware of shipment schedules, a term often applied to White House leadership. Bush's travelogues add intrigue. In March and July 1986, he visited Saudi Arabia and Israel on energy diplomacy missions, days after key arms drops. Congressional investigators later questioned whether these trips doubled as covert diplomacy, though no direct evidence confirms this. Bush's personal diaries, released in 2015, confirm meetings with NSC and CIA officials during Iran-Contra's peak. A June 1986 entry mentions a briefing on sensitive Middle East matters, but lacks specifics, prompting critics to argue it reflects deliberate vagueness. Other meetings, omitted from official White House chronologies, suggest an effort to minimize his paper trail. A 1986 CIA field report cites higher authority approving an Iranian request for hawk parts, a phrase interpreted by some as implicating Bush. Yet a corresponding memo from Bush's office marked "returned without comment" could indicate either tacit approval or bureaucratic distancing. The Tower Commission, established in 1987 to investigate Iran-Contra, described Bush's role cautiously. Its report noted he was briefed, was present at key meetings, and did not raise objections, confirming his knowledge but avoiding direct attribution. This passive language, a hallmark of Washington damage control, shielded Bush from scrutiny while acknowledging his proximity. The Independent Counsel's 1993 report, led by Lawrence Walsh, similarly found insufficient evidence to charge Bush, focusing on North, Poindexter, and others. Walsh later expressed frustration at the administration's stonewalling, particularly the withholding of Bush's diaries, until after the investigation. Bush consistently denied a central role in Iran-Contra. In a 1987 press conference, he declared, "I was out of the loop," a phrase that became a lightning rod for skepticism. The statement's ambiguity, "out of which loop," allowed him to deflect without clarifying his knowledge of arms sales, hostage negotiations, or Contra funding. His defenders argue that as vice president he lacked operational authority, relying on NSC and CIA briefings that may have been incomplete. They note that Reagan, the ultimate decision-maker, also claimed limited awareness, suggesting the operation's secrecy insulated senior figures. Critics counter that Bush's background made ignorance implausible. As CIA director, he oversaw covert operations in Latin America and the Middle East, giving him a nuanced understanding of deniable channels. His Middle East trips, coinciding with arms deliveries, suggest he played a diplomatic role, perhaps reassuring allies like Saudi Arabia or Israel. Congressional investigators questioned why Bush's diaries and travel logs omitted details referenced in NSC memos, pointing to a deliberate effort to obscure his involvement. His silence during the scandal's unraveling, neither whistleblower nor scapegoat, reflects a pragmatic choice to protect Reagan and his own 1988 presidential ambitions. Iran-Contra echoes historical episodes of elite overreach, where insiders bypass democratic checks for strategic ends. The Teapot Dome scandal of the 1920s offers a direct parallel. Oil tycoon Edward L. Doheny bribed Interior Secretary Albert Fall to secure naval oil leases, exploiting hidden channels for personal gain. The scheme, exposed by congressional probes, eroded public trust in government. Iran-Contra, while driven by policy goals, freeing hostages, countering communism, followed a similar playbook. A small circle of elites believing they knew best, bent rules in secret, assuming the public would not notice. A deeper parallel lies in the Umayyad Caliphate's 7th century practice of bribing tribal leaders to quell revolts. Umayyad rulers justified secrecy as a means to stabilize their empire, much as Iran-Contra's architects argued that arming the Contras preserved democracy in Central America. Both cases prioritized ends over means, risking legitimacy when exposed. The Hohenzollern monarchy's covert naval buildup before World War I provides a closer analogy. German officials under Kaiser Wilhelm II funneled funds through off-book accounts to expand battleship production, concealing costs from parliamentary scrutiny. When Britain protested, the paper trail was muddled, thwarting accountability. Iran-Contra's financial diversions, millions laundered through Swiss accounts, mirror this tactic, sanitizing budgets on Capitol Hill while funding guerrillas abroad. Critics see Bush's alleged role as akin to a Hohenzollern minister guiding covert channels while maintaining plausible deniability. Neil Bush's Silverado banking scandal. In the late 1980s, the United States was swept up in a financial frenzy with savings and loan institutions, S&Ls, fueling a speculative boom in real estate and high-risk ventures. Amid this era of easy credit and soaring optimism, Silverado Savings and Loan in Denver, Colorado, became a symbol of excess and failure. At its center was Neil Malin Bush, the third son of George H.W. Bush. As a Silverado director, Neil's involvement in approving insider loans and risky investments led to a $1 billion taxpayer bailout, sparking allegations of negligence, favoritism, and a cover-up to protect the Bush family's reputation. The scandal, documented in exhaustive federal reports, drew comparisons to historical episodes of elite privilege, from Andrew Mellon's tax schemes to Henry Flagler's legislative maneuvers. This analysis explores the Silverado collapse, Neil's role, its historical parallels, and its lasting implications. The 1980s were a transformative decade for American finance. Following the stagflation of the 1970s, Congress sought to revitalize the savings and loan industry, which had traditionally focused on home mortgages. The Depository Institutions Deregulation and Monetary Control Act of 1980 and the Garnes-Saint Germain Act of 1982 loosened restrictions, allowing S&Ls to invest in commercial real estate, junk bonds, and speculative ventures like oil exploration. These reforms aimed to boost homeownership and economic growth but created a volatile environment. With minimal capital requirements and lax oversight, many S&Ls became over-leveraged, chasing high returns without adequate reserves. The era's optimism masked systemic risks, rising interest rates, a cooling real estate market, and a decline in oil prices exposed vulnerabilities in S&L portfolios. By the late 1980s, hundreds of thrifts were insolvent, with losses totaling $160 billion, much of it covered by the Federal Savings and Loan Insurance Corporation, FSLIC, funded by taxpayers. This crisis, known as the S&L debacle, was driven by reckless lending, insider deals, and regulatory failures, setting the stage for Silverado's collapse. Silverado Savings and Loan, based in Denver, epitomized this high-stakes gamble. Founded in 1981, it capitalized on Colorado's booming real estate and energy sectors, financing office parks, condos, and oil field projects. Its board included prominent local businessmen eager to leverage Denver's growth. In 1985, at age 30, Neil Bush joined as a director, bringing limited banking experience but a powerful surname. His father's vice presidency, 1981 to 1989, and presidential candidacy added political weight, raising questions about whether his appointment was merit-based or a strategic move to enhance Silverado's influence. The S&L boom's exuberance mirrored earlier speculative manias, such as the Gilded Age railroad bubbles or the 1920s stock market surge. Like those periods, the 1980s saw financiers prioritized short-term gains over long-term stability, often with insider advantages. Silverado's aggressive lending practices, coupled with Neil Bush's involvement, would soon thrust it into the national spotlight, exposing the dangers of deregulation and elite privilege. Neil Mallon Bush, born in 1955, was the affable, unassuming third son of George H.W. and Barbara Bush. Raised in Texas and educated at Tulane University, he pursued a career in energy, co-founding J&B Exploration in 1980. His move to Denver aligned with Colorado's oil and real estate boom, but his lack of banking expertise made his 1985 appointment to Silverado's board eyebrow-raising. Federal regulators later noted that Neil's primary qualification appeared to be his family name, which promised access to political and financial networks. As a director, Neil participated in loan committee meetings, voting on credit extensions worth tens of millions. Two borrowers, William Walters and Kenneth Good, stood out. Both were Denver developers with close ties to Neil, and their partnerships received substantial loans, often with generous terms like low interest, deferred payments, or minimal collateral. Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, reports later documented that Neil voted to approve or extend loans to Walters and Good, despite warnings from examiners about inadequate collateral and speculative projections. For example, a 1986 loan to a Good-affiliated partnership for a Texas office complex relied on projected rents from an unbuilt property, a risk the FDIC called speculative in the extreme. Neil's relationships with Walters and Good raised red flags. He socialized with both men, and memos later revealed discussions about potential joint ventures, including a Houston project leveraging Silverado contacts. These ties, while not illegal, suggested conflicts of interest, as Neil failed to recuse himself from votes involving his associates. The FDIC's 1991 report accused him of gross negligence, arguing that his actions contributed to Silverado's failure. Neil maintained he never knowingly approved an unsound loan, but regulators countered that a prudent director should have recognized the risks. The scale of Silverado's lending was staggering. By 1988, its portfolio included $1.3 billion in loans, heavily concentrated in commercial real estate and oil ventures. When Denver's economy faltered, oil prices dropped from $30 to $15 per barrel, and commercial vacancies soared. These loans became uncollectible. The thrift's capital reserves, already thin, could not absorb the losses, leading to insolvency. The collapse, a billion-dollar taxpayer burden. By late 1988, Silverado's financial health had deteriorated. Federal examiners who had issued warnings since 1986 found a portfolio riddled with non-performing loans. The thrift's reliance on speculative ventures coupled with inadequate collateral left it vulnerable. In December 1988, the FSLIC declared Silverado insolvent, seizing its assets and closing its branches. The FDIC, tasked with resolving the failure, estimated the cost to taxpayers at $1 billion, drawn from the FSLIC fund. This figure, equivalent to roughly $2.5 billion in 2025 dollars, made Silverado one of the costliest S&L failures. The collapse drew national attention, amplified by Neil Bush's presence on the board. Nightly news broadcasts framed Silverado as a symbol of the S&L crisis, with anchors highlighting the irony of a president's son tied to a billion-dollar bailout. Congressional Democrats, led by Representative Henry Gonzalez, called for hearings accusing regulators of leniency due to the Bush name. Gonzalez argued that the FDIC's slow response and mild penalties reflected immunity by surname, a charge that resonated with a public wary of elite privilege post-Watergate. The FDIC's civil action against Neal and other directors sought damages for negligence. In 1991, Neal settled for $50,000 without admitting wrongdoing, a fraction of the $1 billion loss. Critics viewed this as evidence of favoritism, noting that smaller players faced harsher penalties. The settlement, combined with the Bush administration's distance from the scandal, fueled perceptions of a cover-up, though no direct evidence implicated George H.W. Bush. The FDIC's 1991 report, spanning hundreds of pages, detailed Silverado's mismanagement and hinted at efforts to obscure Neal's role. Board minutes were edited or refiled to downplay risky decisions, and critical memos warning of concentration risk were omitted from director packets. One officer admitted to sensitivity around notes mentioning Bush, suggesting self-censorship to avoid political fallout. The FDIC flagged these actions as evidence of a pattern of concealment designed to protect Silverado's image and, by extension, the Bush family. This choreography of obfuscation echoed historical precedents. In the 1890s, Standard Oil co-founder Henry Flagler secured a controversial divorce by influencing Florida legislators, a maneuver critics called a corporate cover-up. Similarly, Andrew Mellon, Treasury Secretary in the 1920s, used trusts to shield wealth from taxes, preaching fiscal discipline while exploiting loopholes. Silverado's sanitized records suggested a modern equivalent, a thrift shielding a prominent director from scrutiny to preserve political capital. Media coverage amplified these parallels. Columnists compared Neal's case to Georgiana Cavendish, the 18th century Duchess of Devonshire, whose gambling debts were concealed by aristocratic allies to protect her family's reputation. Editorial cartoons depicted Neal as a modern Georgiana, with Denver skyscrapers replacing powdered wigs and the Bush crest adorning foreclosure signs. The phrase, "the brother who crashed a bank," became a media shorthand, capturing the scandal's blend of negligence and privilege. Silverado's collapse fits a broader pattern of elite financial scandals. The Teapot Dome scandal of the 1920s, where oil tycoon Edward L. Doheny bribed officials for naval oil leases, eroded public trust in government. Like Silverado, it involved insiders exploiting influence for gain, with taxpayers bearing the cost. Georgiana Cavendish's hidden debts, covered by her circle to preserve the Devonshire name, mirror Silverado's alleged efforts to protect Neal Bush. Henry Flagler's legislative sleight of hand to secure a divorce parallels the regulatory leniency critics attributed to Silverado's oversight. These cases highlight a recurring theme. Privilege seeks to modulate transparency. Mellon's trusts, Cavendish's IOUs, and Flagler's maneuvers all prioritize private gain over public accountability. Silverado's edited minutes and omitted warnings reflect this instinct, with the Bush name amplifying the stakes. The FDIC's findings, board votes ignoring risk, insider loans to friends, and concealed liabilities, suggest a system where political proximity softened consequences, much as it did for gilded age barons. The S&L crisis itself was a systemic failure, with 747 thrifts collapsing between 1984 and 1992. Yet Silverado stood out due to its scale and Neal's involvement. The billion-dollar loss, while not unique, became a lightning rod for public anger, as ordinary depositors questioned why federal guarantees protected reckless bankers. The perception that Neal faced lighter scrutiny due to his surname fueled distrust, echoing debates over Mellon's tax shelters or Flagler's legal manipulations. Barbara Bush's secret depression struggles. In the 1970s and 1980s, Barbara Pierce Bush was a pillar of the Bush family, known for her sharp wit, maternal warmth, and unflappable presence as her husband, George H.W. Bush, climbed from Texas oil fields to the White House. Yet behind her public persona, marked by triple-strand pearls and a grandmotherly charm, lay a private struggle with clinical depression that nearly overwhelmed her. This battle, fought in secrecy due to the era's stigma around mental health, was concealed to protect the Bush family's political ascent. Documented in biographies, memoirs, and interviews, Barbara's story resonates with historical parallels from Princess Victoria of Hanover to American heiresses like Adelaide Frick, revealing the intersection of privilege, duty, and mental health. This analysis explores her struggle, its concealment, its impact, and its enduring relevance. The 1970s were a turbulent decade in the United States marked by the Vietnam War's end, economic stagflation, and a post-Watergate distrust of institutions. Mental health care, while advancing with new therapies and medications, remained shrouded in stigma. Depression was often dismissed as the blues or a moral failing, particularly for women who faced expectations of stoic domesticity. Therapy was rarely discussed openly, and seeking help could jeopardize social standing, especially for those in the public eye. For political families like the Bushes, whose ambitions hinged on public perception, mental health issues were a liability to be managed discreetly. Barbara Bush, born in 1925 in New York, was the wife of an ascending political figure. George H.W. Bush's career demanded a flawless public image. Barbara, as his partner, played a critical role, hosting fundraisers, charming donors, and raising 5 children, George W., Jeb, Neil, Marvin, and Dorothy. The 1953 death of their daughter Robin from leukemia had tested her resilience, but the depression that struck in the mid-1970s was a different challenge, marked by persistent sadness, anhedonia, and intrusive thoughts. This period coincided with George's tenure in China and the CIA, a time of intense travel and public scrutiny. The Bush family's Houston home in the affluent Tanglewood neighborhood was a hub of activity, but Barbara's private world was darkening. Her struggle, kept hidden to avoid derailing George's career, reflected the broader societal pressure to conceal mental health issues, particularly for women in elite circles. By 1974, Barbara, then 49, began experiencing symptoms of clinical depression. Mornings brought a sense of emptiness, with coffee losing its taste and daily tasks feeling insurmountable. Nights were marked by insomnia and tears she couldn't explain. Kitty Kelly's 2004 biography, The Family, cites friends and hospital sources describing Barbara pacing her home's hallways, counting floorboards to distract from intrusive thoughts, including fears of intruders. One chilling incident, detailed in interviews, occurred while driving on Houston's San Felipe Road, when Barbara briefly considered steering into oncoming traffic, a thought that terrified her into seeking help. This was not a fleeting sadness, but a debilitating condition. Medical records, partially referenced in biographies, list symptoms like anhedonia, inability to feel pleasure, insomnia, and suicidal ideation. The loss of Robin 2 decades earlier had left a lasting scar, but this depression felt different, a pervasive fog rather than a sharp grief. Barbara's public role as a supportive wife and mother clashed with her private despair, amplifying her isolation. She later admitted in her 1994 memoir, Barbara Bush, a memoir, to a low period, a guarded acknowledgement of her struggle. The 1970s mental health landscape offered limited options. Antidepressants like tricyclics were available, but carried side effects and stigma. Therapy, often psychoanalytic, was less common than today, and cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, was emerging but not widely accessible. For a political spouse, seeking help risked exposure in a media environment hungry for scandal. Barbara's decision to pursue treatment was thus a calculated act, undertaken with the secrecy of a covert operation. Barbara sought treatment through discreet channels, a process described in Kelly's biography and corroborated by family friends. A Houston acquaintance connected her with a psychiatrist willing to maintain confidentiality, a necessity given George's rising profile. Barbara took precautions, parking far from the clinic, wearing a low-brimmed hat and avoiding eye contact in waiting rooms to avoid recognition. These measures reflected the era's stigma. Mental health treatment, especially for a woman of her stature, could be misconstrued as weakness or instability, threatening George's political future. Her therapy began in 1974, involving CBT techniques then considered innovative. Sessions focused on identifying catastrophic thoughts, challenging them with evidence, and reframing them with balanced perspectives. Barbara initially resisted medication, fearing it would dull her wit, a key asset in her public role. By mid-1974, however, she agreed to a low dose of tricyclic antidepressants, likely imipramine, which caused side effects like dry mouth and dizziness but gradually alleviated her symptoms. Progress notes, cited in secondary sources, indicate notable improvement by late 1974, attributing her recovery to therapy adherence and George's support. George was initially stunned by the depth of Barbara's struggle. His instinct, honed as a World War II pilot and political strategist, was to fix the problem, but depression offered no clear target. He adjusted his schedule, driving her to appointments and canceling fundraisers when her mood plummeted. At home, he sat with her in silence, offering presence over solutions. This support, detailed in family letters, was crucial, with daughter Dorothy noting in 1975 that Mom is brighter, almost herself again. The Bush children were shielded from the full truth. Barbara and George described her absences as errands or tiredness, a tactic to protect their emotional well-being and the family's public image. Staff avoided filing insurance claims that might leak, and George's advisors were kept in the dark. This secrecy mirrored historical precedents, such as Princess Victoria of Hanover, whose 19th century nervous collapses were concealed to preserve royal optics, or Adelaide Frick, whose depression was hidden behind Pittsburgh's social facade. The secrecy surrounding Barbara's depression was driven by political necessity. In the post-Watergate era, the press scrutinized political families for any hint of scandal, from tax issues to personal failings. Depression, often mislabeled a nervous breakdown, carried a stigma that could derail George's ambitions, particularly as he eyed the 1980 presidential race. A single leak about Barbara's treatment could have been weaponized by opponents, framing her as unstable or George as distracted. The Bushes thus maintained an ironclad veil, a strategy Barbara later justified in her memoirs protecting her family's mission. This concealment had historical echoes. Princess Victoria's panic attacks were dismissed as hysteria, treated with ineffective rest cures, and hidden to maintain the Hanover dynasty's image. Adelaide Frick, wife of industrialist Henry Clay Frick, masked her depression to uphold her family's social standing, funding art therapy programs as a discreet outlet. John Morton Cudahy, a Milwaukee heiress, concealed her loneliness in diaries, channeling her pain into philanthropy. Barbara's silence aligned with this tradition of elite women burying personal struggles to preserve public roles. The effort to maintain this facade was exhausting. Barbara's public duties, hosting charity events, attending political dinners, required her to project warmth while battling inner turmoil. She developed coping mechanisms, such as reciting therapist-taught mantras or clutching her pearls as a grounding ritual. These strategies, noted by aides, allowed her to navigate high-pressure settings, from Houston block parties to Washington galas, without betraying her struggle. Barbara's recovery was gradual, marked by small but significant milestones. By 1975, she could attend PTA meetings without forcing smiles, laugh spontaneously, and wake without dread. Her psychiatrist's notes, referenced in biographies, credit her progress to CBT, medication, and George's unwavering support. He purchased a cassette recorder for her to dictate thoughts during sleepless nights, a practice that helped reframe negative patterns. Many tapes were later lost or reused, but they served as a therapeutic tool, grounding her in moments of crisis. As her condition stabilized, Barbara and George strategized how to address her struggle publicly. Full disclosure risked misinterpretation, especially in a political climate skeptical of mental health issues. Instead, Barbara wove subtle references into her speeches, mentioning dark times or resilience in contexts audiences tied to Robin's death or campaign stress. This approach, detailed in her memoir, allowed her to hint at her experience without inviting scrutiny, a tactic that preserved her public image while laying groundwork for future openness. Her recovery coincided with George's ascent to the vice presidency in 1981, followed by the presidency in 1989. As First Lady, Barbara's public approval soared, with her warmth and humor earning her the nickname America's Grandmother. Yet her private battle informed her public role. She instituted policies like mental health days for White House staff and invited a children's choir from a psychiatric unit to the 1990 Easter egg roll, framing them as special young voices to avoid stigma. During the Gulf War, she prioritized counseling for military families, a reflection of her own experience with emotional hardship. Barbara's story resonates with other elite women who concealed mental health struggles to protect their families' legacies. Princess Victoria of Hanover, whose panic attacks were misdiagnosed as hysteria, was confined to rest cures that failed to address her condition. Adelaide Frick, battling depression after her daughter's breakdown, funded art therapy programs as a private outlet, masking her pain behind philanthropy. Jean Morton Cudahy's diaries reveal a loneliness she sublimated into charitable work, funding a Milwaukee hospital wing for human renewal. These women, like Barbara, navigated societal expectations that demanded stoicism while their private worlds crumbled. Philanthropy often served as a coping mechanism. Barbara's Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy, launched in 1989, promoted reading as a tool for empowerment, echoing her use of books as an escape during her depression. Similarly, Adelaide's art initiatives and Jean's hospital wing transformed personal pain into public good. This pattern, channeling suffering into social capital, reflects a survival strategy for women constrained by public roles, turning vulnerability into a form of influence. These parallels highlight a broader truth. Mental health stigma has long forced elite women to hide their struggles, prioritizing duty over self. Barbara's secrecy, while protective, underscores the systemic barriers that prevent open dialogue, a challenge that persists despite modern advances in mental health awareness. Zapata Oil's secret Cuban operations. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Zapata Offshore, a Houston-based oil company founded by George H.W. Bush, operated innovative drilling rigs in the Gulf of Mexico, pioneering deep-water oil exploration. Persistent allegations suggest these rigs doubled as covert staging points for the Central Intelligence Agency's, CIA, anti-Castro operations, particularly the Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961. While no definitive evidence confirms these claims, circumstantial indicators, vessel re-registrations, cryptic corporate records, crew accounts, and Bush's political connections have fueled speculation for decades. This analysis explores Zapata's operations, the Cold War context, the evidence and gaps, historical parallels, and the broader implications of private enterprises serving clandestine government aims, offering a comprehensive look at a lingering historical mystery. The late 1950s were a period of heightened Cold War tension, with the United States and the Soviet Union vying for global influence. Fidel Castro's 1959 Cuban Revolution, which overthrew a U.S.-backed regime and nationalized American-owned assets, posed a direct challenge to U.S. interests. By aligning Cuba with the Soviet Union, Castro threatened Gulf shipping lanes and regional stability, prompting Washington to prioritize his removal. Under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the CIA developed Operation Pluto, later known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, a covert plan to arm and train Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro. Launched in April 1961, under President John F. Kennedy, the operation relied on secrecy to maintain plausible deniability, avoiding overt U.S. military involvement. The CIA, established in 1947, was experienced in covert operations, having orchestrated coups in Iran, 1953, and Guatemala, 1954. The Bay of Pigs required a complex logistical network. Weapons, rations, radios, and funds needed to reach exile training camps in Guatemala and staging points in the Caribbean, such as the Isle of Pines or Andros Island. Offshore oil platforms located beyond U.S. territorial waters and operated by private firms offered a discreet cover for these activities. Their civilian status, routine maritime traffic, and mobility made them ideal for masking supply transfers or refueling operations, minimizing the risk of international scrutiny. The Cold War's urgency shaped the operation's stakes. A Soviet-aligned Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, was unacceptable to U.S. policymakers. The CIA's need for private sector allies reflected a broader strategy, leveraging commercial entities to execute sensitive missions without implicating the government. Zapata's alleged involvement, if true, would exemplify this approach, blending corporate cover with geopolitical aims in a high-stakes environment. Zapata Offshore, founded in 1954 as a spin-off from Zapata Petroleum, specialized in offshore oil exploration in the Gulf of Mexico. By 1960, it operated a fleet of jackup rigs, including Scorpion, Vinegaroon, and Nola, which could move between lease blocks using innovative technology to stabilize on the ocean floor. These rigs, leased to major oil companies like Gulf Oil, targeted deep-water deposits, a niche that set Zapata apart from competitors. The company's annual reports highlighted revenue growth and technological advancements, projecting an image of commercial success. Allegations of CIA involvement emerged from unusual activities reported by former crew members. Accounts from the 1990s describe pallets wrapped in military-style plastic, logged as machinery but never used in drilling operations, helicopter flights recorded as VIP drops with no identified passengers, and nighttime visits by Spanish-speaking individuals presumed to be Cuban exiles. These activities, while not documented in corporate records, align with the CIA's practice of using civilian infrastructure for covert logistics, as seen in prior operations. In 1960, Zapata re-registered several vessels under Cayman Island affiliates, a move Bush attributed to tax advantages. The timing, however, coincided with the CIA's escalation of anti-Castro activities, including supply routes to Central America. The rig's locations, near Cuban waters and exile staging points, added to suspicions. Zapata's modest size and flexible board structure allowed rapid decision-making, unlike larger firms with extensive shareholder oversight. Bush's pedigree, including his father's Senate role and his own wartime service, enhanced his credibility as a potential CIA partner, making Zapata an attractive candidate for covert collaboration. The company's operations were not without commercial challenges. Offshore drilling was costly, with rig downtime running thousands of dollars per hour. Any covert use would have required careful coordination to avoid disrupting legitimate business, possibly funded by CIA black budget allocations. The lack of shareholder complaints or regulatory flags suggests any such activities were well concealed, aligning with the CIA's emphasis on operational security. The evidence for Zapata's CIA role is circumstantial, rooted in declassified documents, crew accounts, and corporate records. A 1961 CIA cable, released under the 1992 JFK Assassination Records Collection Act, references Platform ZR Alpha as a refueling point for exfiltration flights, with platform details redacted. Zapata's Gulf rigs, operating near Cuban waters, could align with this cryptonym, though no direct link is confirmed. Corporate meeting minutes from 1959 mention special Gulf project budgets marked confidential, even to some board members, coinciding with the CIA's anti-Castro training camps in Guatemala. Financial anomalies add to the puzzle. Zapata's Cayman subsidiaries recorded cash inflows of tens of thousands of dollars in 1959 to 1960. Sums modest for a corporation, but consistent with CIA payments to exile operatives, such as boat captains or trainers. Former CIA logistics officers, in oral histories, alluded to friendly oilmen providing drop points for equipment like underwater demolition gear without naming specific firms. These accounts, while suggestive, lack the specificity of signed contracts or manifests. Crew anecdotes describe irregular activities. Supply boats docking at odd hours, offloading crates that bypassed standard inspections, helicopters ferrying geologists without drilling equipment, and brief visits by Spanish-speaking passengers. These stories, while compelling, lack primary documentation, such as logbooks or invoices, making them vulnerable to skepticism. However, they fit the CIA's pattern of using civilian cover, as seen in operations like the 1954 Guatemala coup, where private firms facilitated logistics under commercial pretexts. The absence of definitive proof reflects CIA tradecraft, which prioritizes compartmentalization and deniability. Contracts might have been verbal, routed through law firms, or buried in number-only accounts. The destruction of records post-Bay of Pigs, a common agency practice, further obscures the trail. The lack of a smoking memo aligns with precedents, like the U2 program, where evidence emerged only decades later through declassification. Zapata's alleged CIA role fits a historical pattern of private enterprises serving U.S. foreign policy. In the 19th century, Warren Delano II amassed an opium fortune in China, providing Washington with trade insights that shaped the open door policy. During World War I, J.P. Morgan facilitated arms and loans to the Allies, nudging U.S. neutrality toward intervention. These cases illustrate how commercial ventures can mask strategic aims, aligning profit with national interests. The 1858 Plombières Agreement offers a European parallel. Count Cavour and Napoleon III plotted Italy's unification in a secret meeting disguised as a holiday excursion, concealing their plans to avoid diplomatic repercussions. Similarly, Zapata's rigs, if used by the CIA, operated under the cover of commercial drilling, shielding Eisenhower and Kennedy from accusations of direct involvement in the Bay of Pigs. Both cases relied on secrecy to execute high-stakes maneuvers, with civilian entities providing a buffer against scrutiny. Post-World War II examples reinforce this pattern. United Fruit's logistical support for the 1954 Guatemala coup, orchestrated by the CIA, mirrors Zapata's alleged role as a supply hub. ITT's covert funding of anti-Allende forces in the 1970s Chile further demonstrates how firms blend business and statecraft. Zapata, if involved, would join this lineage, its rigs serving as floating outposts in a Cold War proxy war, with Bush's involvement amplifying the political stakes. The Bay of Pigs invasion, launched on April 17, 1961, was a catastrophic failure. Cuban forces repelled the Exile Brigade, capturing over 1,000 prisoners and exposing U.S. involvement. Kennedy, humiliated, denied direct military support, though declassified cables later confirmed CIA orchestration. The fiasco sparked global outrage, strained Latin American relations, and prompted domestic inquiries, making any link to a private firm like Zapata politically explosive. George H.W. Bush, who entered Congress in 1966, had a clear motive to keep such ties buried to protect his political ascent. The CIA's concealment tactics, shredding documents, using cutouts, classifying reports, ensured minimal traceability. Zapata's corporate records, sanitized for shareholders, omit operational details, while its Cayman subsidiaries dissolved or merged, obscuring financial trails. Bush's later dismissal of the allegations as a desire to mastermind world events deflected scrutiny with humor, but declassified cables noting friendly assets in Zapata area kept the debate alive. The lowercase Zapata may refer to a geographic region, but its timing fuels speculation. The political context explains the secrecy. A confirmed Zapata CIA link could have derailed Bush's career, particularly as he rose to the vice presidency, 1981 to 1989, and presidency, 1989 to 1993. Like the Plombières Agreement's architects who hid their plans to avoid European backlash, the CIA and Zapata's leadership likely prioritized operational security, ensuring no paper trail implicated a future president. The absence of evidence, while frustrating, aligns with the agency's doctrine of plausible deniability, as seen in operations like the 1953 Iran coup. Researchers continue to pursue a definitive Zapata-CIA connection, focusing on declassified records and corporate archives. Files from the JFK era, partially released under the 1992 Act, include cables and reports hinting at energy firms aiding anti-Castro operations. Ship registries, rig logbooks, and Cayman financial records could reveal unusual depreciation schedules or wire transfers from CIA shell accounts. A 1960 Panamanian customs log, noting a Zapata tug offloading engineering parts near a CIA rehearsal site, suggests a link, but without bills of lading, it remains inconclusive. Future discoveries, a contract, tying a rig to a CIA budget line, or an unredacted cable naming Zapata could resolve the debate. Accessing Cayman records requires costly litigation, and many subsidiaries' files are lost or inaccessible. Scholars propose digitizing offshore ledgers to uncover anomalies, such as payments for marine consumables inconsistent with drilling operations. Until such evidence emerges, the case relies on a mosaic of crew accounts, financial hints, and declassified fragments, each suggestive but not conclusive. The archival challenge reflects the nature of covert operations. The CIA's use of verbal agreements, shell companies, and document destruction, as seen in the U-2 program or Bechtel's Iran roll, obscures paper trails. The Zapata case, like these, thrives in ambiguity, with researchers balancing speculation against the need for verifiable evidence.